Hi and welcome to the Archive of History. It is just before dawn in the heart of the Sahara Desert, and the world is suspended in a darkness so complete that the stars above seem close enough to touch. The sand beneath your feet still holds the cold of night, a chill that will vanish within hours under the merciless sun. There is no sound except the whisper of wind across endless dunes, carrying with it the scent of distance and time. Somewhere in this vast ocean of sand, at the very edge of the world as many once knew it, lies a city that should not exist. A city built of mud and dreams, of gold and knowledge, of faith and ambition. A city whose very name became synonymous with the ends of the earth, yet which once stood as one of the most learned and wealthy places on the planet. This is Timbuktu, the golden city of knowledge, and tonight we will journey back to its streets, its libraries, its mosques, and its scholars. We will walk among those who transformed a desert outpost into a beacon of civilization, who created one of the greatest centers of learning the medieval world had ever seen. Before we drift off, I am always curious to know where my listeners are tuning in from and what time it is that they are listening tonight. Let me know in the comments. The story of Timbuktu is not the story you might expect. It is not a tale of conquest and empire alone, though those elements are woven through its history like golden thread through fine cloth. It is primarily a story about the power of the written word, about the human hunger for knowledge, about communities that chose scholarship over warfare, books over swords. It is about a place where the wealth of gold was surpassed by the wealth of ideas, where libraries were more precious than palaces, where a man's worth was measured not by his lineage or his army, but by the depth of his learning and the quality of his mind. In our modern world, Timbuktu has become a metaphor for remoteness, for the far edge of the map, for places unreachable and unknowable. Yet for nearly 500 years it was the opposite. It was a crossroads, a meeting place, a destination sought by traders and scholars from 3 continents. To understand how this transformation occurred, how a seasonal encampment beside a desert well became home to 100,000 manuscripts and some of the finest minds in the Islamic world, we must travel back in time and across the sand. Now, let the noise of the modern world fade away. Let go of the glow of screens and the hum of engines. Close your eyes and imagine a world lit only by stars and oil lamps, a world where information traveled at the speed of a camel's walk, where a single book could take months to copy by hand, where knowledge was so precious that men would cross 1,000 miles of desert to obtain it. Tonight you will experience what it was like to live, study, and seek wisdom in medieval Timbuktu. You will feel the sand in your sandals and the weight of precious manuscripts in your hands. You will hear the call to prayer echoing across mud-brick walls and smell the acrid smoke of evening cooking fires. You will understand how a city emerged from nothing and became everything, at least for a time. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and prepare to journey to the golden city at the edge of forever. The story begins not with grandeur but with necessity in the stark and beautiful emptiness of the southern Sahara Desert, perhaps 11 or 12 centuries ago, though the exact date has been lost to time and sand. Imagine the landscape first. This is not the sweeping, romantic desert of adventure films. This is the Sahel, the shore of the sand sea, where the true desert gives way gradually to scrubland, where acacia trees cling to life in defiance of the heat, where seasonal rains can transform dust into temporary green. The air here shimmers with heat during the day, making distant objects waver and dance like mirages. At night, the temperature plummets, and you can see your breath in the starlight. This is a landscape of extremes, of harshness and subtle beauty, where water is life and shade is salvation. In this unforgiving environment, the Tuareg people had moved for centuries, following their herds of goats and camels, navigating by stars and landmarks known only to them, their faces wrapped in indigo cloth against the sand and sun. They were the masters of the desert, the guides and guards of the trade routes, the blue-veiled warriors and merchants who knew every well and every danger between the Mediterranean coast and the lands of gold to the south. Among these nomadic groups, there are stories of a woman named Buktu. The tales say she was left to guard a seasonal encampment while the men traveled with their herds. Near her tent was a well, precious and reliable, one of the few sources of water in this particular stretch of emptiness. Travelers began to speak of the well of Buktu, Timbuktu in the Tuareg language, the place of Buktu. Whether or not Buktu herself existed as a historical person, or whether she is a personification of the settlement's humble origins, We cannot know with certainty. What we do know is that a well existed here, and around that well, a seasonal camp gradually became something more permanent. The location was not arbitrary. This spot sat at a crucial intersection, a point where two worlds met. To the north stretched the Sahara proper, that vast emptiness that had to be crossed to reach the markets of North Africa and the Mediterranean beyond. To the south flowed the great Niger River, that life-giving artery that curved through the grasslands and forests where gold was mined and kingdoms rose and fell. Timbuktu sat precisely at the junction, where camel met canoe, where the desert traders who brought salt and goods from the north could meet the river traders who brought gold, ivory, and enslaved people from the south. This geographic position was Timbuktu's first and perhaps greatest advantage. In an age before roads or railways, when the movement of goods depended entirely on human and animal power, location was destiny. A place that controlled the intersection of trade routes controlled wealth itself. The well of Buktu began to see more permanent structures. Tents of leather and woven grass were replaced or supplemented by simple dwellings made from what the desert provided. The primary building material was banko, a mixture of mud, straw, and sometimes dung, formed into bricks and dried in the relentless sun. These structures were humble, low to the ground, their thick walls providing insulation against the brutal heat of day and the cold of night. The architecture was purely functional at first, designed for survival rather than beauty. As the seasons cycled and the years accumulated, the settlement grew. Word spread along the invisible network of desert routes that there was water here, that it was a safe place to rest, that exchanges could be made. The Tuareg who controlled the area welcomed this development. Trade meant taxes, tolls, and fees. It meant information and news from distant places. It meant that the desert's value was increasing, that the empty places they called home were becoming valuable precisely because of their position between richer lands. By the 11th or 12th century, Timbuktu was no longer merely a camp, it was becoming a village, then a town, a permanent fixture in the mental maps of the traders who crossed the Sahara and navigated the Niger. The people who gathered here were diverse from the beginning. There were Tuareg, the original desert lords. There were Songhai fishermen and farmers from the river. There were Songhai and Mandinka traders from the southern kingdoms, and increasingly there were Arabs and Berbers from the north, bringing with them not just goods but ideas, including the faith that would transform Timbuktu from a trading post into a center of civilization. Islam had spread across North Africa in the centuries following the Prophet Muhammad's death in the 7th century. By the time Timbuktu was emerging as a settlement, the entire Maghreb, the western edge of the Islamic world, was Muslim. The traders who crossed the Sahara were almost all adherents of this faith, and they brought it with them like precious cargo. Islam was more than a religion. It was a complete way of life, a legal system, a cultural framework, and crucially for Timbuktu's future, a tradition of literacy and learning. Muslims were required to read the Quran, which meant communities needed teachers, scholars, and eventually schools. The faith emphasized education, the preservation of knowledge, and the copying and study of texts. Where Islam spread, libraries and schools followed. This was the seed from which Timbuktu's golden age would eventually grow, but that flowering was still centuries away. For now, the settlement was modest, its wealth measured in sacks of salt and gold dust rather than books and manuscripts. The rhythm of life in early Timbuktu was dictated by the rhythms of trade, which in turn were dictated by the rhythms of the desert. The great caravans that crossed the Sahara could not move during the height of summer, when the heat was murderous and water sources became unreliable. They traveled instead during the cooler months, setting out from cities like Fez, Marrakech, or Tripoli with hundreds or even thousands of camels, heavily laden with goods. The journey could take 2 to 3 months of continuous travel, moving from oasis to oasis, navigating by stars and inherited knowledge, constantly alert to the dangers of sandstorms, bandits, and simple human error that could lead a caravan to die of thirst mere miles from salvation. When a caravan arrived at Timbuktu, it was an event. You would hear them before you saw them, the sound of bells and the groaning of camels, the shouts of drivers and guards. The animals would be exhausted, their mouths foaming, their legs trembling. The men would be covered in dust and sunburnt. Despite their protective clothing, their eyes red from sand and squinting from the glare. They brought with them the goods of the Mediterranean world and beyond. There were bolts of cloth, fine fabrics that could not be produced locally. There were luxury items like glassware and metalwork from European and Middle Eastern craftsmen. There were books and paper, precious commodities in a place where literacy was beginning to matter. There were horses, highly valued in West Africa, but above all they brought salt. Salt was the white gold of the trans-Saharan trade. In the desert itself, far to the north at places like the mines of Tagaza, salt existed in such abundance that buildings could be constructed from blocks of it. But in the lands south of Timbuktu, in the kingdoms along the forest edge where gold was plentiful, salt was desperately scarce. Human beings need salt to survive, particularly in hot climates where perspiration depletes the body's stores. Without it, people sicken and die. The agricultural societies of the Sudan, as the broad belt of grassland south of the Sahara was called, had gold in their rivers, but no source of salt. This created one of history's most profitable exchanges. Salt from the desert went south, gold from the rivers went north. Timbuktu sat precisely in the middle. The caravans that arrived from the north would rest in Timbuktu, replenish their water, pay their fees to the local rulers, and prepare for the next stage of their journey. Some goods would be transferred to riverboats, long wooden canoes carved from single trees, capable of carrying heavy loads along the Niger's waters. Other traders would continue overland to markets in the southern kingdoms. When they returned, they brought gold, not in the form of coins or jewelry, but as dust and small nuggets, weighed carefully on precise scales, wrapped in leather pouches, worth more than its weight in anything else. They brought ivory, the white gold, tusks from elephants hunted in the forests. They brought cola nuts, stimulants prized across the Islamic world, and they brought people, enslaved men and women captured in wars or raids, a grim and constant element of this trade network that we cannot ignore or romanticize away. The profits from this exchange were staggering. A load of salt purchased cheaply at Tagaza could sell for 10 or 20 times its cost in the southern markets. Gold purchased in the south could command even higher premiums in the Mediterranean cities. Timbuktu's merchants, who facilitated these exchanges and took their cuts, began to accumulate real wealth. This wealth in turn allowed the town to grow. More permanent structures were built. Defenses were erected, though Timbuktu was never truly a fortified city in the European sense. Its protection came from its position, from the desert itself, and from the goodwill of the Tuareg who controlled the surrounding territory and had no interest in killing the source of their income. As the decades passed and the centuries turned, Timbuktu transformed. What had been a collection of mud huts around a well became a proper town with distinct quarters, market areas, and growing numbers of permanent residents. Families of merchants established themselves, building larger compounds with interior courtyards, storage rooms for goods, and spaces for extended families. The Tuareg remained influential, but they were increasingly joined by settled populations of various ethnic groups, all drawn by the possibility of prosperity that trade offered. The town developed its own identity, neither purely nomadic nor purely sedentary, neither exclusively local nor foreign, but a hybrid creation born of commerce and necessity. And then Islam began to change everything. The first mosques were simple affairs, perhaps nothing more than an open space with a wall indicating the direction of Mecca for prayer. But as the Muslim population grew, and as wealth accumulated, more substantial structures became possible. Religious scholars began to arrive, drawn by opportunities to teach and serve a growing community of believers. These early scholars were often traders themselves, men who combined commercial acumen with religious learning, who could calculate the complex inheritance divisions required by Islamic law and also guide a caravan across the desert by the stars. They established Quranic schools where boys and sometimes girls learned to recite and eventually read the holy text in Arabic. This was revolutionary. Arabic literacy meant access to a universe of knowledge far beyond the Quran itself. The Islamic world had preserved and expanded upon the learning of ancient Greece and Rome, had made advances in mathematics and astronomy, medicine and philosophy, geography and history. All of this knowledge existed in Arabic texts, and once a community could read Arabic, it could access this intellectual heritage. Timbuktu's transformation from trading post to center of learning had begun, though it would take the intervention of the most famous ruler in West African history to truly catalyze the change. That transformation was still ahead in time, building slowly like a storm gathering on the desert horizon. For now, in these early centuries, Timbuktu was prosperous but not yet legendary. It was important but not yet magnificent. It was literate but not yet scholarly. The foundations were being laid in mud brick and manuscript, in the patient teaching of Arabic letters and the careful copying of texts. The city was learning to read before it learned to write its own destiny. The future golden age was germinating in the desert soil, waiting for the right conditions to bloom, and those conditions would arrive in the 14th century, carried on the ambitions of an empire and the vision of a king whose pilgrimage to Mecca would change the course of Timbuktu's history forever. But before we follow that story into its golden flowering, we must understand the arteries that fed it, the trade routes themselves. We must journey with a caravan across the Sahara, feel what it meant to cross that emptiness, understand the systems and skills that made such journeys possible. Because without the trans-Saharan trade, there would have been no wealth. Without wealth, there would have been no patronage of learning. And without learning, Timbuktu would have remained what it began as, a well in the sand, a place whose name was known only to a few desert travelers, rather than a city whose reputation spread to the courts of Cairo and Cordoba, Constantinople and beyond. The crossing of the Sahara was not an adventure, but a calculated risk, a dangerous but potentially lucrative business proposition undertaken by men who understood the stakes. To journey with a caravan meant committing yourself to weeks or months of hardship, placing your life in the hands of guides whose knowledge was the only thing standing between you and death by thirst. Imagine joining such a caravan as it prepares to depart from a northern city, perhaps Sijil Massa, at the edge of modern Morocco, a place that once served as the great southern terminus of the Moroccan kingdom and the last major settlement before the desert proper began. The organization required for such a journey was immense. A large caravan might include thousands of camels and hundreds of men. There were the merchants themselves, the men who owned the goods being transported. There were hired camel drivers and handlers, men whose entire lives were spent in this work. There were armed guards, necessary protection against bandits who haunted certain stretches of the route. There were guides, usually Tuareg or other desert peoples, whose navigational knowledge was literally invaluable. And there were enslaved people, forced to walk the entire distance, chained together, part of the cargo being transported south. The camels were the essential technology that made the crossing possible. Specifically, the dromedary, the single-humped Arabian camel, had been introduced to the Sahara perhaps 1,000 years before Timbuktu's rise, and it transformed what had been a nearly impassable barrier into a navigable, if dangerous, highway. Camels could go days without water, storing energy in their humps and maintaining body temperature more efficiently than almost any other domesticated animal. They could eat the sparse desert vegetation that would starve a horse or donkey. They could carry enormous loads, up to 400 pounds, across terrain where wheeled vehicles were useless. They were stubborn, foul-tempered, and prone to biting and spitting at their handlers, but they were irreplaceable. Before departure, the caravan would gather its supplies. Water was the most critical concern. Each man would need a large goatskin water bag, and additional water would be loaded onto pack camels. But water is heavy, and there was a limit to how much could be carried. The caravan's route had to be planned meticulously to move from one water source to another, from oasis to oasis, never allowing more days to pass than the water supply could sustain. A miscalculation, a dried-up well, a sandstorm that disoriented the guides, any of these could doom the entire enterprise. The desert is littered with the bones of caravans that made fatal errors. Food was simpler than water. The staples were dates, dried and sweet, dense with energy. There was dried meat, hard bread, and millet flour that could be mixed with water to make a paste. Nothing fresh would survive the journey. Everything had to be preserved, lightweight, and nourishing. Cooking was minimal, usually just a simple fire at evening camp to warm tea and prepare a basic meal. Fuel for fires was scarce in the deep desert, so dried camel dung was collected and used when available. The smell of it burning, acrid and earthy, would become one of the constant sensory markers of the journey. The departure itself would come at dawn or even before, to take advantage of the cooler morning hours. The camels would be loaded, a complex process requiring skill as the loads had to be balanced perfectly, or the animals would develop sores or become lame. The men would wrap their faces in long cloth, the tagelmust worn by the Tuareg, layers of indigo-dyed cotton that protected against sun, sand, and the abrasive wind. The dye would stain their skin blue, and the Tuareg became known in some accounts as the blue men of the desert. Then the caravan would begin to move. a long line stretching across the sand, the led camels following the guides who walked ahead, the rest following in practiced formation. The first days of travel, while still near the desert's edge, would be almost manageable. There would still be occasional scrub vegetation, the possibility of encountering other travelers, the psychological comfort of knowing that settlements existed not too far behind. But soon, within a few days, the character of the landscape would change utterly. The scrubland would give way to emptiness. The Sahara proper would embrace the caravan, and the true test would begin. You would walk for hours in near silence, the only sounds the creaking of leather saddles, the shuffling footfalls of camels, the occasional command shouted down the line. Speech was discouraged during the hottest hours. It dried the mouth and wasted moisture. The heat would be your constant companion and your enemy. By midday, the sun would be directly overhead, white and merciless. The sand itself would become too hot to touch with bare skin. The air would shimmer and distort. Distant dunes would seem to float above the horizon. You would learn to recognize false wells, mirages that appeared so convincing that even experienced travelers could be momentarily fooled. The body would rebel against the conditions. Lips would crack and bleed. Skin would burn despite the protective clothing. Eyes would ache from squinting against the glare. Every swallow of water would be measured, rationed, savored. The caravan would travel until the heat became truly unbearable, then halt for the worst hours of the day. Tents would be raised if the group was large enough to carry them, or simple shelters constructed from cloth draped over sticks or even just held up by the camels themselves. Men would lie in whatever shade they could create, panting, trying to conserve moisture, waiting for the sun to descend. This was when the vulnerability was greatest. This was when the desert felt most like an enemy, actively trying to kill you. Some men would pray. Others would sleep fitfully. All would count the days until the next oasis, the next reliable water. As evening approached and the temperature began its rapid fall, the caravan would rouse itself and continue. These evening hours of travel were almost pleasant by comparison, the air cooling, the light turning golden and then orange, the shadows lengthening. The pace would quicken slightly. Sometimes the drivers would sing, rhythmic chants that helped maintain the walking pace and lifted spirits. When full darkness came, the caravan would halt again and make camp. Fires would be lit if fuel was available. The evening meal would be prepared and eaten. Water would be distributed under careful supervision. Guards would be posted to watch for bandits or wild animals, though in the deep desert there was little that threatened beyond the environment itself. The night sky would reveal itself in all its stunning glory. With no light pollution, no moisture in the air to create haze, the stars would appear in numbers impossible to describe. The Milky Way would stretch overhead like a river of light. The guides would check their position against these stars, using knowledge passed down through generations, an oral library of celestial navigation that was every bit as sophisticated as the written navigation manuals used by European sailors. They knew the stars' positions through the seasons, knew how to compensate for the Earth's rotation, knew landmarks invisible to outsiders, but clear as signposts to their trained eyes. The cold of the desert night would be shocking to those unprepared for it. You would wrap yourself in whatever blankets or cloaks you had, huddle close to the dying fire, and try to sleep despite the discomfort. Rest was essential. The next day would be another trial, and the day after that, and the one after that. The journey would begin to feel endless, a repetitive cycle of heat and cold, thirst and rationed water, walking and stopping, until the mind numbed to it and the body moved on discipline alone. This was when the weak began to fail. Illness could strike, dysentery from bad water, fever from unknown causes. An injured camel could collapse and have to be abandoned or slaughtered. Arguments would break out between tired, frightened men. The discipline of the caravan leaders was essential to prevent chaos. And then there were the storms. A sandstorm in the Sahara was a terror unlike anything experienced by those from gentler climates. You would see it coming sometimes. A wall of brown rising on the horizon, advancing like an army. When it struck, visibility would drop to nothing. The sand would be everywhere, in your eyes, your nose, your mouth, working its way through every gap in your clothing. The wind would howl, and the camels would groan and fold their legs, lowering themselves to the ground and turning away from the blast. The men would crouch beside them, using the animals' bulk as windbreaks, covering their faces, enduring. Such storms could last hours or even days. When they finally passed, the landscape would be altered. Dunes would have shifted. Landmarks would be buried or revealed. The guides would have to reorient, find their position again, and hope that the storm had not pushed them too far off course. The salt mines of Tagaza, roughly halfway across the central Saharan route, were a destination for many caravans. This place was barely habitable, a hellish location where enslaved people and desperate workers extracted slabs of salt from underground deposits. The settlement, such as it was, consisted of buildings made entirely from salt blocks because no other building material was available. The water here was brackish and foul-tasting, barely drinkable. The heat was constant, but the salt was pure and valuable, and caravans would stop here to take on loads of it, great rectangular slabs that would be strapped to camels and transported south. From Tagaza, the journey would continue, across more emptiness, more days of endurance, until finally, after weeks of travel, the character of the land would begin to change again. Vegetation would reappear, first as scattered drought-resistant scrub, then more abundantly. Birds would be seen for the first time in weeks. The air would smell different, less sterile, carrying hints of soil and growing things. Water would become more reliable, and then finally, whether approaching from the north or the south, the destination would appear. For those coming from the north, it would be Timbuktu, its mud brick walls and towers rising from the edge of the desert like a vision, like a promise of safety and rest and the end of suffering. The arrival would be a moment of profound relief and joy. The surviving members of the caravan, thinner now, weathered, their clothing stiff with dried sweat and dust, would enter the city's markets and begin the business that had motivated this entire ordeal. The merchants would negotiate prices, calculate profits, assess the success or failure of their venture. The camel drivers would rest their animals, see to injuries and fatigue, and everyone would drink clean water, eat fresh food, and sleep without the fear of dying of thirst in their dreams. Timbuktu was sanctuary. It was civilization. It was the reward for surviving the desert's test. This was the human effort that undergirded everything that followed. The wealth that funded the mosques, the courage and greed that fed the libraries. Trade was the foundation upon which learning would be built. The wealth that flowed through Timbuktu in these centuries of the trans-Saharan trade's height was difficult to comprehend by modern standards. Individual merchants could amass fortunes that would make them the equivalent of millionaires. The city's rulers, who taxed the trade and controlled access to resources, became fabulously rich, and this wealth did not simply pile up in treasuries. It was spent, invested, and most importantly for our story, it was donated to religious and educational causes. This was not mere charity or vanity, it was a religious obligation. In Islam, one of the 5 pillars of the faith is zakat, the giving of alms, a mandatory donation of a portion of one's wealth to support the poor and to fund communal needs, including education and the construction of mosques. The richer Timbuktu's merchant class became, the more resources became available for religious and scholarly purposes. The first mosques were modest, but as wealth grew, so did architectural ambitions. The distinctive Sahelian style of mosque architecture began to develop, a style that would make Timbuktu's religious buildings instantly recognizable. These structures were built entirely from banko, the sun-dried mud brick that was the desert's most abundant building material. The walls were thick, sometimes several feet deep, providing insulation and strength. The exteriors were smoothed with a mud plaster that had to be reapplied after every rainy season, a constant maintenance requirement that became a communal activity. The most distinctive features were the wooden beams that protruded from the walls at regular intervals. These were not merely decorative, they served as permanent scaffolding, allowing workers to climb the walls for repairs without needing ladders. The mosques featured tall, tapering minarets from which the call to prayer would sound 5 times daily, the sound echoing across the city's narrow streets and flat rooftops. Inside, the prayer halls were forests of thick columns supporting wooden roofs, creating cool, dim spaces where the heat of the day could not penetrate. The floors might be covered with mats or simply swept clean sand. The mihrab, the niche indicating the direction of Mecca, would be decorated with what sparse ornamentation the austere Maliki school of Islamic law permitted. This was not the elaborate arabesque and tile work of a Moroccan or Persian mosque. It was simpler, more austere, reflecting the desert environment and the theological conservatism of the region's scholars. Around these mosques, schools began to form. At first these were informal. A learned man would gather students in his home or in a corner of the mosque and teach them to recite the Quran. But as the community grew and as more scholars arrived, drawn by Timbuktu's increasing reputation and wealth, these informal arrangements evolved into more structured institutions. The madrasas, the Islamic schools, began to appear. These were dedicated buildings or sections of larger complexes where students could study, sometimes boarding there, sometimes commuting from their family homes. The curriculum was traditional and rigorous. It began with memorization of the Quran, a process that could take years and required prodigious feats of memory. A student who successfully memorized the entire text was called a hafiz, one who preserves, and was granted considerable respect. But memorization was only the beginning. Once a student had internalized the Quran, the real education could start. They would study Arabic grammar and rhetoric, essential tools for understanding the holy text at a deeper level. They would study hadith, the collected sayings and actions of the Prophet Muhammad, which served as a secondary source of religious law and guidance. They would study fiqh, Islamic jurisprudence, learning how to derive legal rulings from the Quran and hadith, how to resolve disputes, how to guide a community in matters of inheritance, marriage, commerce, and crime. This was intensely practical knowledge. A skilled scholar could serve as a judge, a legal consultant, a community leader. It was a profession, and it could be lucrative. Beyond religious studies, the more advanced students would encounter other disciplines. Mathematics was taught, both for its practical applications in trade and surveying, and for its theological significance. Astronomy was studied, crucial for determining prayer times and the direction of Mecca, but also pursued for its own sake. Medicine was another field of study, with Islamic civilization having preserved and expanded upon Greek and Roman medical knowledge. Geography, history, and even poetry were part of the curriculum for those who showed aptitude and could afford to continue their education into advanced studies. The education was oral and textual. A student would read texts with their teacher, discuss them, memorize key passages, and eventually, if they showed promise, begin to write their own commentaries and treatises. This educational culture was well established in Timbuktu by the 14th century. The city had scholars, students, and functioning schools. It had a literate population, at least among the elite. It had libraries, though these were mostly private collections belonging to individual scholars or wealthy families. What it did not yet have was the international reputation, the sheer scale of intellectual activity, and the vast accumulation of manuscripts that would define its golden age. That transformation required a catalyst, and it arrived in the form of political change and the vision of a king. Timbuktu was about to be swept up into the expansion of the Mali Empire, one of the greatest powers medieval Africa had produced. And the ruler who would bring Timbuktu into this empire, Mansa Musa, would also make it famous across the entire Islamic world and beyond. Mansa Musa ascended to the throne of Mali in approximately 1312, though dates from this period are imprecise and debated by scholars. Mali at this time was already a significant power, controlling the gold-producing regions to the south and much of the territory between the Sahara and the forest edge. The empire was built on the wealth of gold, on the control of trade routes, and on a sophisticated administrative system that incorporated diverse ethnic groups and local rulers into a hierarchical structure. Musa inherited this wealth and power, but his reign would expand it to new heights and, crucially, would transform how the empire was perceived by the wider world. In the year 1324, Mansa Musa undertook the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca that every Muslim is obligated to perform once in their lifetime if they are able. This was not unusual. Many West African rulers had made the pilgrimage before him. What was unusual, what became legendary, was the scale and opulence of Musa's caravan. The accounts recorded by Arab historians and travelers describe a procession of staggering magnitude. They speak of 60,000 people accompanying the emperor, though this number may be exaggerated, or may include enslaved people and servants who were not all traveling the entire distance. They speak of 100 camels, each carrying 300 pounds of gold dust. They speak of Musa dispensing gold so freely during his months-long stay in Cairo that he temporarily disrupted the Egyptian gold market, causing inflation that took years to correct. Whether every detail of these accounts is literally accurate is less important than what they represent. Mansa Musa's Hajj was a spectacular demonstration of wealth. It announced to the Islamic world that Mali was not some backward frontier kingdom, but a major power, rich beyond imagination, worthy of respect and attention. The Mansa distributed gold to scholars, to the poor, to merchants, to anyone who approached him. He purchased property and goods. He made such an impression that word of his journey spread throughout the Mediterranean and the Middle East. Timbuktu, which was by this point part of Mali's empire, became associated in people's minds with this unimaginable wealth. If Mali's ruler could travel with 100 camel loads of gold, what must his cities be like? What opportunities might exist there for merchants and scholars? When Mansa Musa returned from his pilgrimage, he brought more than prestige and memories. He brought scholars and architects from the Islamic heartlands. Among them was a poet and architect from Granada in Islamic Spain, a man named Abu Ishaq al-Sahili. The Mansa commissioned al-Sahili to design and oversee the construction of new mosques and palaces in his empire's cities, including Timbuktu. The result was the Dengreba Mosque, or the Great Mosque, one of Timbuktu's most important architectural landmarks. This structure represented a leap forward in scale and ambition from earlier buildings. It was larger, its minaret taller, its prayer hall more capacious. It could accommodate hundreds of worshippers. It became the city's central religious site, the place where Friday prayers were held, where scholars taught, where the community gathered. The mosque was not just a place of worship. It was a statement. It declared that Timbuktu was a city of consequence, a place where God was honored with magnificent architecture, where learning would be supported and celebrated. The construction employed hundreds of workers, using the traditional techniques of Banco construction, but on an unprecedented scale. The wooden beams were sourced from forests to the south and transported at great expense. The details were carefully considered, from the layout of the prayer hall to the design of the minaret. When it was completed, it stood as the most impressive structure in the city, visible from a distance, a beacon for travelers approaching across the desert. Mansa Musa's patronage extended beyond architecture. He established libraries, though these were likely attached to mosques and schools rather than standalone institutions at first. He invited scholars to settle in Timbuktu and other cities of his empire, offering them stipends and support. He created an environment where learning was not just respected but actively encouraged and funded. This was the turning point. This was when Timbuktu transitioned from being a prosperous trading city with some educational infrastructure to being a magnet for scholars and students from across the Islamic world. The seeds planted by the early Muslim traders and teachers were now watered with imperial gold, and they began to grow into something extraordinary. The decades following Mansa Musa's death saw Mali continue to dominate the region, though succession disputes and the challenges of governing such a vast territory created periods of instability. But Timbuktu's scholarly reputation continued to grow, almost independent of political shifts. The city was developing its own identity, its own internal dynamics that transcended whoever sat on the imperial throne. The merchant families that had grown wealthy from trade invested their fortunes in education, building schools, endowing teaching positions, accumulating books. The culture of learning became self-sustaining, a virtuous cycle where knowledge attracted students, students became scholars, scholars attracted more students, and the community's intellectual capital continually increased. By the 15th century, Timbuktu had become one of the most important centers of Islamic scholarship in the world. It was spoken of in the same breath as Cairo, Fez, Damascus, and Cordoba. Students came from as far away as Morocco, Egypt, and even Arabia to study with Timbuktu's masters. Scholars from Timbuktu traveled to these other centers and returned with new knowledge, new texts, new ideas. The city was part of a vast intellectual network that spanned 3 continents, a network bound together by a common language, Arabic, a common faith, Islam, and a common commitment to the preservation and advancement of knowledge. This was the Golden Age, the era when Timbuktu truly earned its reputation as the city of knowledge. To understand what this meant in practice, we must step into the daily life of the city during these extraordinary centuries. Imagine waking in Timbuktu in the year 1500, during the reign of the Songhai Empire, which had by then replaced Mali as the dominant regional power. You rise before dawn, as the city is stirring to life. The air is cool, the heat of the day still hours away. If you are a student or scholar, you live in a modest compound, perhaps shared with other students, in one of the city's residential quarters. The house is built around a central courtyard. its thick mud brick walls providing privacy and insulation. Your room is small, sparsely furnished with a sleeping mat, a low wooden table for reading and writing, and perhaps a wooden chest where you keep your few possessions, and most preciously, your books. The first sound you hear is the call to prayer, the adhan, chanted from the minaret of the Niger mosque and echoed by the muezzins at the city's other mosques. The sound is beautiful, melodic, a human voice calling the faithful to worship before the sun has risen. You perform your ablutions, washing hands, face and feet with water from a clay jar. Then wrap your outer robe around yourself and walk through the narrow streets toward the mosque. The streets are unpaved, sand and packed earth, winding between high walls that preserve the privacy of family compounds. Other figures move in the dim light, silent or murmuring greetings, all heading in the same direction. The mosque is cool inside, its thick walls and high ceiling trapping the night's chill. You find a place among the rows of worshippers, all facing toward the mihrab, and thus toward Mecca, far to the northeast across the desert and the Mediterranean. The prayer is recited, the familiar words and movements that have been performed 5 times a day for nearly 9 centuries since the Prophet established them. There is comfort in the ritual, in the knowledge that at this same moment, Muslims across the world are performing the same actions, speaking the same words. When the prayer concludes, you do not immediately leave. Some men remain to recite additional prayers or to sit in quiet meditation. Others gather in small groups to discuss religious matters or simply to exchange news. As dawn breaks and light begins to filter through the mosque's small windows, you leave and return to your compound. If you are fortunate, there will be a simple breakfast waiting, perhaps a porridge made from millet, sweetened with honey if available, or dates and bread left from the previous night. You eat quickly. There is study to be done before the day's heat makes concentrated thought difficult. You return to your room and retrieve the text you are currently working through, perhaps a commentary on Islamic law, perhaps a work of theology or philosophy. The book is a manuscript, hand-copied, its pages sewn together and bound in leather. It is not your personal property but borrowed from your teacher or from a merchant who owns a small library and is willing to lend to serious students. You read slowly, mouthing the words, following the elaborate Arabic script with your finger. The text is dense, complex, assuming knowledge of earlier works and filled with nuanced arguments. You make notes on a wooden board covered with a layer of washable ink, writing out difficult passages, summarizing arguments, noting questions to ask your teacher. This is the core of education in Timbuktu. The patient solitary engagement with texts, the slow accumulation of understanding, the building of mental structures that allow you to navigate the vast corpus of Islamic thought. Reading is not a passive activity, but an active wrestling with ideas, a conversation across time with scholars who may have died centuries ago, but whose words live on in these carefully preserved pages. As the morning progresses and the heat begins to build, you make your way to the home of your teacher. This is a more substantial compound than your student lodging, with multiple rooms arranged around a large courtyard, where a small tree provides a patch of precious shade. Your teacher is a respected scholar, a man in his 50s who has spent decades studying, who has traveled to Egypt and Morocco to learn from other masters, who has written several commentaries that are copied and studied throughout West Africa. He supports himself through a combination of teaching fees, payments for legal consultations, and stipends from wealthy patrons who fund his work in exchange for prayers and prestige. You are not his only student. When you arrive, several others are already seated in the courtyard, their writing boards and books spread before them. The teacher emerges from his private quarters and greets you all, then settles onto a cushion against one wall. The session begins with recitation. Each student must demonstrate that they have memorized the assigned passage from the previous session. This is done orally, without reference to the text. Mistakes are gently corrected. Memorization is the foundation of all advanced study, the database that scholars carry in their minds, accessible without the need for constant reference to physical books. Once recitation is complete, the teacher begins the day's lesson. He reads a passage from a text, perhaps a famous legal treatise, perhaps a work of theology. He reads it aloud, slowly, with proper pronunciation and rhythm. Then he explains it, unpacking the meaning, discussing the context, comparing this scholar's opinion to those of others who have addressed the same question. He might digress into related topics, tell stories to illustrate points, quote poetry from memory, demonstrate how a particular legal principle applies to real situations that might arise in Timbuktu's markets or courts. The students listen intently, asking questions when permitted, taking notes, absorbing not just information but method, learning how to think like a scholar. This session might last several hours. When the heat of midday approaches and concentration becomes difficult, the teacher dismisses his students. You return to your lodging, eat a simple lunch, and then rest during the hottest hours, as the entire city slows to a halt and waits for the worst of the heat to pass. In the late afternoon, as the temperature begins to fall, life resumes. This is when you might go to the markets. Timbuktu's markets were famous throughout the region. Great open areas where merchants displayed their goods, where the wealth that flowed along the trade routes was converted into commodities. The air would be filled with the sounds of negotiation, the smells of spices and cooking food, the visual riot of colorful fabrics and gleaming metalwork. There were sections for different types of goods. Here the cloth merchants selling everything from rough local weaves to fine imported silks. There the metal workers selling tools, weapons and jewelry. Over there the food vendors with piles of dates, dried fish, fresh vegetables from the gardens along the Niger River, bags of millet and rice. And then there was the book market. This was unique to Timbuktu among West African cities, a testament to the city's intellectual culture. Here merchants specialized in the trade of manuscripts. They sold books imported from North Africa and Egypt, rare texts that could command extraordinary prices. They sold locally produced manuscripts, copies made by Timbuktu's growing community of professional scribes. They bought used books from scholars who needed money, selling them onward to new readers. The trade in books was serious business, with some merchant families specializing in it for generations, developing expertise in authentication, pricing, and preservation. As a student, you could not afford to buy books, but you could admire them, could sometimes negotiate to borrow a text for copying, could dream of the day when your own scholarship might be advanced enough to merit owning a personal library. You would see merchants examining manuscripts carefully, checking the quality of the paper or parchment, the clarity of the handwriting, the accuracy of the text. A single important book could sell for the price of several camels or a year's income for a modest merchant. Knowledge had literal measurable value in Timbuktu's economy. Beyond the markets, the city revealed itself in layers. There were the grand mosques, focal points of religious and social life. There were the compounds of the wealthy, with their high walls and guarded gates, hiding interior courtyards, where fountains played and gardens grew in defiance of the desert climate. There were the humbler neighborhoods, where artisans and laborers lived, where the sounds of hammering and weaving, children playing and women singing drifted through narrow alleys. There were the areas near the river docks, where fishermen brought in the day's catch and boat builders constructed the canoes that carried goods along the Niger. The city was a functioning community of perhaps 50,000 people at its height, diverse in occupation and origin, bound together by commerce, faith, and the desert that surrounded them. The social structure was complex and hierarchical. At the top were the scholars, the ulama, men whose knowledge commanded respect and whose legal opinions shaped community behavior. Alongside them were the wealthy merchants, men who might not be learned but who controlled trade and thus wealth and thus power. Below them were the artisans and skilled workers, the scribes and builders, the boat makers and blacksmiths, respectable people with necessary skills. Lower still were the unskilled laborers and servants, and at the bottom, invisible in most accounts, but essential to acknowledge, were the enslaved people, captured in wars or raids, bought and sold in markets, performing the hardest labor for no compensation, their suffering, an integral part of the economic system that funded the golden age we now celebrate. Women's roles were varied, and sometimes contradictory by modern expectations. In public, they were often veiled and separated from men outside their families, following conservative Islamic practice as interpreted by the Maliki legal school dominant in the region. But they could own property, conduct business, and in some cases receive education. There were female scholars, though they were rare and their work often went unrecorded in histories written by men. Women ran households, which in wealthy families were complex operations requiring sophisticated management skills. They raised children, preserved food, managed servants, and maintained the social networks that bound families together. They were less visible in public records, but no less essential to the city's functioning. Evening would bring the fourth prayer of the day, Maghrib, at sunset. Then the final prayer Isha, after darkness had fully fallen. Between these prayers the main meal would be eaten, a communal affair in most households. If you were a student living in a shared compound, you would eat with your fellow students, sitting on mats around a large shared bowl, eating with your right hand, taking rice or millet porridge mixed with vegetables or rarely, and on special occasions, meat. Fish from the Niger River was more common than meat from livestock, which was expensive and reserved for festivals or important events. After the evening meal, if you had access to oil for lamps, you might study more, reading by the flickering light, straining your eyes over difficult passages, or you might join other students in discussion, debating points of law or theology, testing arguments, sharpening rhetorical skills. These informal discussions were as important as formal classes, a way of processing and integrating what you had learned, of discovering the gaps in your knowledge, of building the intellectual community that would sustain you throughout your scholarly career. As night deepened and fatigue set in, you would eventually sleep, knowing that before dawn the call to prayer would wake you again and the cycle would resume. This was the rhythm of life for the scholarly class, the students and teachers who gave Timbuktu its reputation. But the city was more than its schools. It was a living community, and to understand its golden age fully, we must explore the institutions that made it not just a place of learning but a center of intellectual production, a place where knowledge was not just consumed but created. We must enter the libraries and universities, the spaces where Timbuktu's scholars did their most important work, where they engaged with the Islamic intellectual tradition and contributed their own voices to its ongoing conversation. The term university is somewhat anachronous when applied to medieval Timbuktu. The institution did not have the formal structure of a European university of the same period, with its degrees, departments, and bureaucratic organization. Rather, Timbuktu's universities were clusters of scholars and students gathered around major mosques, particularly the three most important: the Dijingweba Mosque, built by Mansa Musa's architects, the Sankore Mosque in the city's intellectual heart, and the Sidi Yahya Mosque. These were not single buildings but complexes, including the mosque itself, attached schools or madrasas, and the private homes of scholars who taught nearby. Students would move between these centers, studying with different teachers, accumulating knowledge and credentials in a flexible, personalized educational system. The Sankore Mosque complex became the most famous of these centers, giving its name to what later historians would call the University of Sankore. It was located in the city's northeast quarter, an area that became associated with scholarship and learning. The mosque itself was built in traditional Sahelian style, its most distinctive feature being its pyramidal minaret that rose in 3 stages, each level slightly smaller than the one below. The prayer hall could accommodate perhaps 1,000 worshippers. Around it clustered the homes of scholars, and in these homes and in the mosque's courtyards and side rooms teaching took place. A student's progression through the system was not fixed or standardized. It depended on individual ability, financial resources, and the recognition of teachers. You would begin as a child with basic Quranic memorization. If you showed promise and your family had resources, you would continue to more advanced texts. Eventually, you would seek out a recognized master in a particular field and study with him, perhaps for years. When your teacher judged you competent, he would grant you an ijaza, a certification that you had mastered a particular text or subject and were qualified to teach it yourself. This was not a diploma in the modern sense, but a personal authorization, a link in a chain of transmission that ideally stretched back through generations of teachers to the original author or even to the Prophet Muhammad himself in matters of hadith and Islamic law. The subjects taught were comprehensive. At the foundation was always religious knowledge, the Quran and its interpretation, the hadith and their authentication, Islamic law in its various schools of thought. But the curriculum extended far beyond theology. Arabic language and literature were studied intensively, both for their religious importance and for their aesthetic value. Poetry was memorized and analyzed. Grammar was explored in minute detail. Rhetoric and logic, inherited from the Greek philosophical tradition through Arabic translations and commentaries, were taught to those pursuing advanced studies. Mathematics held an important place, both pure and applied. Students learned arithmetic, algebra, and geometry. They studied the works of great Islamic mathematicians like Al-Khwarizmi, whose name gives us the word algorithm. They learned how to use these tools for practical purposes like calculating inheritance shares according to Islamic law, determining trade profits, and surveying land. Astronomy was closely linked to mathematics and was pursued both for its religious applications, determining prayer times and the start of lunar months, and for its own intellectual interest. Timbuktu's scholars made astronomical observations, calculated planetary positions, and debated cosmological questions. Medicine was another significant field. The works of ancient Greek physicians like Galen and Hippocrates were available in Arabic translation, as were the writings of great Islamic physicians like Ibn Sina, known in Europe as Avicenna. Students learned anatomy, the theory of humors that dominated pre-modern medicine, the properties of medicinal plants, and diagnostic techniques. Timbuktu had practicing physicians who could set bones, treat wounds, prescribe herbal remedies, and perform minor surgery. The knowledge was limited by the era's lack of understanding of germ theory and many other modern medical principles, but within those constraints, Islamic medicine represented the most advanced medical knowledge available anywhere in the medieval world. History and geography were also studied. Scholars read chronicles of the Prophet's life and the early Islamic conquests. They studied the histories of dynasties and empires. They learned geography through works that described the known world, its cities and regions, its peoples and customs. For merchants, this knowledge was practical. For scholars, it was part of understanding God's creation in its full diversity. And some scholars in Timbuktu began to write their own historical works, chronicling the events of their own times and the histories of the West African kingdoms. These chronicles are among our most important sources for understanding the period. The libraries where these texts were housed were mostly private collections, owned by wealthy individuals or scholarly families. A prosperous merchant might own several hundred manuscripts, a major scholar perhaps 1,000 or more. These collections were jealously guarded but not entirely closed. A scholar who owned rare texts would lend them to trusted colleagues or advanced students, sometimes charging a fee, sometimes in exchange for access to other collections. Networks of trust and reciprocity allowed knowledge to circulate despite the lack of large public libraries. The manuscripts themselves were beautiful objects. They were written on paper, much of it imported from North Africa or the Middle East, though some was manufactured locally using techniques learned from Arab craftsmen. The best paper was smooth and durable, able to withstand years of use. The text was written in black ink made from soot or lamp black mixed with gum arabic, which gave it a deep permanent color. Important passages might be marked in red ink. The handwriting varied depending on the scribe's skill and the purpose of the manuscript. Scholarly texts meant for serious study were written in a clear, functional script. Luxury copies of the Quran or important works might be written in elaborate calligraphic styles with decorative elements and illuminated chapter headings. The production of manuscripts was a skilled craft and a significant industry in Timbuktu. Professional scribes spent their days copying texts, either working to order for specific clients or producing copies speculatively to sell in the book market. A scribe would sit cross-legged with a wooden writing board across his lap, the manuscript he was copying propped beside him. He would work with intense concentration, reproducing the text word for word, checking and rechecking for errors. A mistake in copying a religious text was not just a professional failure but potentially a sin, a corruption of God's word, or a scholar's teaching. Speed and accuracy were both essential. A skilled scribe could copy perhaps 4 to 8 pages a day, depending on the complexity of the text and the quality of writing required. When a manuscript was complete, it would be sewn together, the pages carefully aligned and bound with thread. A cover might be added, usually leather, sometimes dyed and decorated. The wealthiest clients might commission tooled leather covers with geometric patterns or verses from the Quran. The finished book was a valuable object, representing dozens or hundreds of hours of labor, expensive materials, and irreplaceable knowledge. It would be treated with reverence, stored carefully, handled with clean hands, and protected from moisture and insects that could damage the pages. Over the centuries, these manuscripts accumulated. Families built collections across generations, with fathers passing their libraries to sons, who added to them and passed them onward. Scholars who traveled brought back texts from other cities. Merchants imported books as valuable trade goods. By the height of Timbuktu's golden age in the 16th century, the city may have contained between 300,000 and 1 million individual manuscript pages, bound into perhaps 100,000 or more books. This was an astonishing concentration of written knowledge for a city of its size and location, rivaling the great libraries of Cairo and Fez. The scholars who worked with these texts were not merely preserving old knowledge, though preservation was important. They were also creating new knowledge, contributing to the ongoing intellectual conversation that defined Islamic civilization. They wrote commentaries on earlier works, explaining difficult points, resolving apparent contradictions, offering new interpretations. They wrote original treatises on legal questions specific to West African contexts, on astronomical observations made from Timbuktu's latitude, on historical events they had witnessed or learned about from reliable sources. They engaged in written debates with scholars in other cities, their letters and treatises circulating along the trade routes that brought gold and salt. One of the most famous scholars of Timbuktu was Ahmed Baba, who lived in the late 16th and early 17th centuries, just before the city's golden age began to fade. Ahmed Baba was a polymath, knowledgeable in law, theology, history, and biography. He wrote more than 40 books in his lifetime, most of which were lost when his library was destroyed during the Moroccan invasion, but several survived and were widely studied. His most famous work that remains is a biographical dictionary of scholars in the Maliki legal school, an enormous compilation that demonstrated his mastery of the entire Islamic legal tradition. He was also known for his legal opinions on contemporary issues, including a famous fatwa, or religious ruling, in which he argued that the enslavement of many people then being traded through Timbuktu was unlawful under Islamic law because they had been Muslims before their capture. This opinion was controversial and often ignored, but it shows that Timbuktu's scholars did not merely parrot received wisdom but engaged seriously with moral and legal questions. Ahmed Baba's personal library was said to contain 1,600 volumes, making it one of the largest private collections in the city. This gives you some sense of the intellectual resources available to a major scholar. He could consult hundreds of works without leaving his home, could compare different commentaries on a single question, could trace the development of ideas across centuries. This access to texts, combined with his own formidable intellect and decades of study, allowed him to make contributions to Islamic scholarship that were recognized far beyond Timbuktu. When he was later forcibly taken to Morocco as a captive and spent years in exile there, he became one of that country's leading scholars, teaching at the famous Qarawiyyin University in Fez, and earning a reputation that helped spread Timbuktu's fame. The intellectual life of Timbuktu during its golden age was intense and sophisticated. It was not isolated from the broader Islamic world, but deeply connected to it through travel, correspondence, and the circulation of texts. A scholar in Timbuktu might read a work written in Baghdad 4 centuries earlier, write a commentary on it, and have that commentary reach Cairo or Damascus within a few years, carried by traveling merchants or scholars making the Hajj. The city was a node in a vast network of learning, contributing to and drawing from the collective intellectual heritage of Islamic civilization. This achievement was all the more remarkable for having occurred in a place that many in the Islamic heartlands would have considered peripheral, a frontier region far from the great centers of power and culture. But Timbuktu's scholars refused to accept a subordinate status. They insisted on the universality of Islamic learning, on the idea that knowledge and piety mattered more than geography or ethnicity. A text copied in Timbuktu was as valuable as one copied in Damascus. A legal opinion from a Timbuktu scholar was as authoritative as one from Cairo, provided the scholar had the necessary qualifications and knowledge. This intellectual confidence, backed by genuine achievement, was part of what made the Golden Age golden. But nothing lasts forever. The conditions that created Timbuktu's intellectual flourishing were fragile, dependent on political stability, economic prosperity, and the continued flow of trade along routes that could be disrupted by conflict or competition. As the 16th century progressed, these conditions began to erode. The trans-Saharan trade, while still important, was no longer the world's only route for moving goods between Africa and the Mediterranean. Portuguese explorers had begun sailing down the African coast, opening sea routes that bypassed the Sahara entirely. The political situation in the region was becoming unstable. And far to the north in Morocco, a new power was rising with ambitions that would soon turn toward the wealthy lands of the Sudan and toward Timbuktu itself. The Songhai Empire, which had controlled Timbuktu and much of the region since the mid-15th century, was formidable at its height. Under leaders like Sunni Ali and Askia Muhammad, Songhai had built an efficient administrative system, maintained a powerful army, and supported the scholarly culture that Timbuktu embodied. But by the late 16th century, the empire was weakening. Succession disputes had created instability, the military was less disciplined than it had been, and the empire's wealth, which came largely from controlling the gold trade, was becoming increasingly attractive to outside powers who saw an opportunity for conquest. In Morocco, the Saadidian dynasty had recently consolidated power and was looking for ways to enrich itself and expand its influence. The Moroccans were well aware of the wealth that flowed through Timbuktu and the gold-producing regions to the south. They had the advantage of access to European military technology, particularly firearms, which were still rare in West Africa. In 1591, the Moroccan Sultan dispatched an army across the Sahara with orders to conquer the Songhai Empire and seize control of the gold trade. The army was relatively small, perhaps 4,000 men, but it was well armed with muskets and cannons and led by experienced commanders. The journey across the desert was brutal. The Moroccan army suffered significant losses just reaching its destination, with men and animals dying of thirst and exhaustion. But the survivors pressed on, driven by the promise of gold and conquest. The decisive battle came at Tondibi, near the Niger River not far from Timbuktu, in March of 1591. The Songhai army was much larger, perhaps 40,000 men, but it was primarily armed with traditional weapons like spears, bows, and swords. When the Moroccan forces opened fire with their muskets and cannons, the effect was devastating. The noise and smoke, the impact of bullets and cannonballs broke the Songhai lines. The battle became a rout. The Songhai emperor fled, and within days the Moroccan army entered Timbuktu. The conquest marked the beginning of a long, slow decline for the city. The Moroccans were occupiers, not legitimate rulers in the eyes of most of the population. They demanded gold and other tribute, requisitioning wealth and disrupting trade. They were suspicious of the city's scholars, who wielded moral authority and could potentially organize resistance. In a particularly tragic episode, many of the leading scholars, including the great Ahmed Baba, were arrested and sent into exile in Morocco. Ahmed Baba was forced to leave behind his enormous library, which was largely destroyed or scattered. He spent years in Marrakech, where his learning eventually earned him respect and students, but he never ceased longing for Timbuktu and eventually was allowed to return, though the city he came back to was diminished from the one he had left. The Moroccan occupation established a military government that prioritized extraction of wealth over maintenance of the scholarly and commercial culture that had made Timbuktu valuable in the first place. The soldiers and administrators sent to govern the region gradually lost contact with Morocco itself, becoming a distinct ruling class, neither fully Moroccan nor integrated into local society. They intermarried with local populations, their descendants forming a group known as the Ama, who continued to dominate politically but could not recreate the prosperity or stability of earlier eras. Trade patterns shifted as well. The trans-Saharan routes, while never completely abandoned, became less important as European maritime trade increased. Portuguese and later Dutch, English and French ships could carry goods along the African coast and across the Atlantic more cheaply and safely than camel caravans could cross the Sahara. The gold that had once flowed north to Mediterranean markets was increasingly diverted to European ships on the coast. Timbuktu, which had thrived because of its position on trade routes, now found itself bypassed, its location becoming a disadvantage rather than an asset. The city did not collapse immediately. Scholarly activity continued, though at a reduced level. Families that had accumulated large libraries did their best to preserve them, passing manuscripts from generation to generation, maintaining the tradition of learning even as resources dwindled. But the golden age was definitively over. By the 17th century, Timbuktu was already fading into the realm of legend in European consciousness, remembered not as it had actually been but as a mythical city of gold, a place of fabulous and mysterious wealth at the ends of the earth. This mythologized version of Timbuktu would persist for centuries, outliving the reality that had inspired it. The succeeding centuries were hard ones. The city's population decreased as economic opportunities diminished. Political control shifted repeatedly between local powers, none of whom could recreate the stability of the earlier empires. The desert, always a threat, began to encroach more aggressively. Droughts became more frequent or more severe, perhaps due to climate changes, perhaps simply because the infrastructure for maintaining wells and managing water had deteriorated. Buildings fell into disrepair as resources for maintenance disappeared. The magnificent mosques were still maintained, kept alive by community effort and religious devotion, but palaces and schools crumbled. European explorers who eventually reached Timbuktu in the 19th century, after years of attempts and numerous deaths from disease and violence, were often disappointed. They had expected to find a city of gold, palaces and wealth. Instead, they found a modest desert town of mud brick buildings, poor and politically unstable, baking under the Saharan sun. The Scottish explorer, Alexander Gordon Lemming, reached Timbuktu in 1826 and was murdered shortly after. The French explorer René Callier arrived in 1828, disguised as a Muslim, and stayed for 2 weeks before leaving. His account described a city that bore little resemblance to the legends. He wrote of narrow streets, humble houses, and poverty, though he also noted the mosques and the scholarly tradition that still persisted in attenuated form. These accounts reinforced a narrative in European minds that Timbuktu had always been mythical, that its reputation was never deserved. But this was a misunderstanding born of temporal disconnect. The Europeans were seeing the city after centuries of decline, after the collapse of the trade networks and political systems that had supported its golden age. It would be like visiting Rome in the year 1000, seeing its reduced population and crumbling monuments, and concluding that the Roman Empire had never really been powerful or magnificent. Timbuktu's golden age had been real, but it was gone, and the physical evidence that might have proved it to skeptical European visitors had largely disappeared, or was hidden in private family collections that outsiders were not permitted to see. The colonial period brought new indignities. France gradually extended its control over the West African interior in the late 19th century, and Timbuktu became part of French Sudan, later the colony of French West Africa. The colonial administration was more interested in extracting resources and establishing control than in preserving the city's cultural heritage. The scholarly families who still maintained manuscript collections did so privately, sometimes hiding their books from colonial authorities who might confiscate them or from looters who might sell them. The tradition of scholarship continued in attenuated form, with fathers teaching sons to read Arabic and study the Quran, but the great intellectual networks and institutional support of the Golden Age were long gone. Independence came to Mali in 1960, and Timbuktu became part of the new nation. The post-colonial period brought some renewed attention to the city's heritage. Scholars and historians, both Malian and international, began to recognize the significance of the manuscript collections that still existed in private hands. Projects were initiated to catalogue and preserve these manuscripts, to build proper archive facilities, to train librarians and conservators. The mosques, despite centuries of neglect, were restored. In 1988, the historic city of Timbuktu was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site, recognizing its importance to human history and culture. But preservation work faced enormous challenges. The manuscripts, many of them centuries old, were fragile. They had survived in Timbuktu's dry climate, but they were vulnerable to humidity, insects, handling, and fire. Many were stored in conditions far from ideal, stacked in rooms or buried in chests, slowly deteriorating. Efforts to catalogue them revealed the stunning scope of what had been preserved. Families brought out collections that had been hidden for generations, revealing thousands upon thousands of manuscripts on every subject imaginable. Estimates of the total number of surviving manuscripts in Timbuktu and the surrounding region eventually reached into the hundreds of thousands, an extraordinary archive of West African and Islamic intellectual history. In recent years, Timbuktu has faced new threats: political instability, armed conflicts, and the rise of extremist groups in the Sahel have repeatedly endangered the city and its heritage. In 2012, Tuareg separatists and later Islamist militants seized control of northern Mali, including Timbuktu. During this occupation, extremists who viewed the veneration of saints and certain scholarly practices as un-Islamic attacked some of the city's shrines and threatened the manuscript collections. In an extraordinary act of courage and devotion, librarians and ordinary citizens smuggled thousands of manuscripts out of the city, hiding them in private homes or evacuating them to safety in Bamako and elsewhere. When the militants were eventually driven out by French and Malian forces in 2013, much of the heritage had been saved, though some manuscripts were lost or damaged. This modern chapter in Timbuktu's long history demonstrates the ongoing tension between the city as a living place and the city as a symbol. between its needs as a poor community in one of the world's least developed regions and its importance as a repository of human knowledge and culture. The people of Timbuktu today are not museum curators but ordinary human beings trying to build lives and livelihoods in difficult circumstances. Yet they also carry the weight of history, the knowledge that their city once stood at the center of the world, that their ancestors created something extraordinary, and that they are the custodians of a legacy that belongs not just to them but to all humanity. The manuscripts that have been preserved offer a window into that extraordinary past. When you see one, when you look at pages written 5 or 6 centuries ago by a scholar sitting in a Timbuktu compound, the connection to the Golden Age becomes tangible. The handwriting is clear, the arguments sophisticated, the knowledge impressive. Here is a mathematical treatise explaining geometric principles. There is a commentary on Islamic law addressing a question that arose in Timbuktu's markets. Here is a letter between scholars discussing a point of theology, their written debate captured on paper and preserved across the centuries. These are not abstract historical facts, but the products of real human minds, people who lived and studied and wrote in pursuit of understanding. The physical city today bears the marks of its long history. The great mosques still stand, though they require constant maintenance and have been rebuilt and repaired countless times over the centuries. The Dijingweba Mosque, commissioned by Mansa Musa more than 6 centuries ago, still hosts prayers 5 times a day. The Sankara Mosque, heart of the university complex, remains a place of worship and study. The Sidi Yahya Mosque, with its own legendary history, continues to serve its community. These buildings are made of mud and wood, ephemeral materials that should not have survived centuries of heat, wind, and occasional rain. But they persist because each generation has chosen to maintain them, to replaster the walls, to replace the wooden beams, to preserve the forms and functions even as the materials themselves are renewed. Walking through Timbuktu today, you can still trace the outline of the Golden Age. The narrow streets wind between high walls, creating the same patterns they did 500 years ago. The market still functions, though the goods sold there now are more likely to be Chinese plastic goods and motor oil than gold and manuscripts. The Niger River still flows nearby, its seasonal floods still bringing life to the desert's edge. The desert still surrounds the city, and caravans still occasionally arrive, though they are more likely to be tourist expeditions than trade convoys. The sense of remoteness remains, the feeling that this is a place apart, separated from the modern world by vast distances and deep time. The legacy of Timbuktu extends far beyond the city's physical boundaries or its manuscript collections. It challenges us to think differently about African history, about medieval civilization, about the geography of knowledge. For too long, European and American education taught a story of civilization as something that flowed in a narrow channel from ancient Greece and Rome through medieval Europe to the modern West, with everywhere else relegated to the margins. Timbuktu's Golden Age demonstrates the poverty of that narrative. Here was a city in the heart of Africa, south of the Sahara, that created a sophisticated intellectual culture, that preserved and advanced human knowledge, that connected to global networks of learning while maintaining its own distinct identity. The scholars of Timbuktu were not imitating some foreign model, but participating in a genuinely universal intellectual project, the Islamic scholarly tradition, while also addressing questions specific to their own context. They proved that geography does not determine intellectual capacity, that a city built of mud brick can house minds as brilliant as any in marble palaces. They demonstrated that the production of knowledge is not the monopoly of any region or culture, but a human capacity that can flower wherever the conditions exist to support it. Political stability, economic surplus, and a culture that values learning. This is perhaps the most important lesson Timbuktu offers to the present. In an age when we worry about the preservation of knowledge, about the fragility of civilization, about the possibility of intellectual and cultural decline, Timbuktu stands as both warning and inspiration. It warns us that golden ages end, that prosperity and learning are not self-sustaining, that they require constant effort and favorable conditions to maintain. The decline of Timbuktu was not inevitable, but it was also not easily preventable. The forces that undermined it, political instability, economic disruption, military conquest, were powerful and difficult for a single city to resist. But Timbuktu also inspires because the tradition did not die. Even through centuries of decline, even through conquest and colonialism, even through the forgetting and misunderstanding of the outside world, The families of Timbuktu preserved their manuscripts, maintained their mosques, taught their children. They kept alive the memory of what the city had been, and the possibility that it might yet recover something of its former glory. When the world finally turned its attention back to Timbuktu in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, when scholars began to seriously study the manuscripts and recognize their significance, it was because the people of Timbuktu had never given up, had never allowed their heritage to be completely erased. There is something deeply moving about this persistence. It speaks to a fundamental human need to preserve our stories, to remember our achievements, to pass something of value to future generations. The manuscript collections of Timbuktu are not just historical documents. They are acts of faith, declarations that knowledge matters, that the work of scholars and teachers 500 years ago still has meaning and value today. Every time a manuscript is cleaned and repaired, every time it is digitized and made accessible to researchers, every time a student in Timbuktu or anywhere else reads the words written by a long-dead scholar, that golden age lives again, however briefly. The story of Timbuktu also challenges us to think about what we mean by civilization and progress. The narrative of linear advancement, the idea that human societies inevitably move from simple to complex, from backward to advanced, from ignorance to enlightenment, does not fit Timbuktu's history. The city reached extraordinary heights and then fell. It was more sophisticated, more learned, more cosmopolitan in the 15th and 16th centuries than it would be in the 19th or early 20th. Progress is not guaranteed. Civilizations can move backward as well as forward. What is built can be destroyed. What is learned can be forgotten. But the reverse is also true. What is lost can be recovered. What is forgotten can be remembered. The rediscovery of Timbuktu's intellectual heritage in recent decades has restored the city to its rightful place in the history of human civilization. Scholars around the world now study Timbuktu's manuscripts, learning from them, recognizing the sophistication of the thought and the breadth of the knowledge they contain. West African students can look to Timbuktu with pride, seeing evidence that their ancestors built great centers of learning, that African intellectual history is as rich and complex as any other region's. This recovery of historical memory is itself a significant achievement, one that helps to combat the legacy of colonialism and the erasure of African accomplishments from global narratives. Timbuktu today faces an uncertain future. The challenges are immense: poverty, political instability, climate change, making an already harsh environment more difficult, the ongoing threat of extremism and violence. The city's population is small, perhaps 50,000 people, many of them struggling to meet basic needs. Yet efforts continue to preserve the manuscripts, to maintain the mosques, to tell the story of what Timbuktu was and what it might yet become. International organizations provide support. Scholars and conservators work to digitize manuscripts and create conditions for their long-term preservation. The government of Mali, despite its own difficulties, recognizes Timbuktu as a national treasure. There is also a growing effort to make Timbuktu's heritage accessible not just to scholars but to ordinary people, both in Mali and around the world. Museums are being established. Educational programs are being developed. Digital archives make manuscripts available to anyone with internet access, allowing a student in New York or Beijing to read the same texts that a scholar in 16th century Timbuktu studied. This democratization of knowledge would have pleased the city's medieval scholars who believed in the importance of spreading learning, of training new generations, of ensuring that wisdom was not hoarded but shared. As we come to the end of our journey through Timbuktu's history, it is worth reflecting on what this city represents. On one level, it is a specific place with a specific history, a desert town that rose to greatness and then declined, leaving behind buildings and books as evidence of what it had been. But on another level, Timbuktu is a symbol, a reminder of human potential and human fragility. It shows us what can be achieved when diverse people come together around a shared commitment to learning, when wealth is used not just for luxury, but to support scholarship, when a community values books as much as gold. It also shows us what can be lost. The golden age of Timbuktu lasted perhaps 2 or 3 centuries, a brief moment in the long span of human history. The forces that ended it, military conquest, economic disruption, political instability, are forces that have destroyed countless other civilizations throughout history and continue to threaten communities and cultures today. Timbuktu's manuscripts survived largely by chance because the desert's dry climate prevented their decay, because families chose to preserve them rather than sell or destroy them, because in recent decades people recognized their value and acted to protect them. Had any of these factors been different, the evidence of Timbuktu's golden age might have been lost entirely, and future generations would never have known what this African city had accomplished. This precariousness, this fragility of human achievement, should give us pause. We live in an age of extraordinary technological advancement, of instant global communication, of more knowledge available at our fingertips than the scholars of Timbuktu could have imagined. Yet we also live in an age of conflict and inequality, of environmental destruction, of books and libraries, and even languages disappearing. The same forces that brought down Timbuktu, violence, disruption, the breakdown of the systems that support learning and culture, still threaten us. The lesson is not to despair but to value what we have, to protect it, to pass it on. The scholars of Timbuktu understood this. They spent their lives copying books, teaching students, writing commentaries, preserving knowledge for future generations. They could not have known that their city's golden age would end, that their great libraries would be scattered, that centuries would pass before their achievements were fully recognized again. But they did the work anyway. They believed in the value of knowledge for its own sake, in the importance of the intellectual tradition they had inherited, in their responsibility to maintain and extend it. That commitment, that sense of duty to past and future, is what allowed anything to survive at all. As you imagine Timbuktu now, in the quiet darkness of night, picture the city under its vast dome of stars, the same stars that guided caravans across the desert, that medieval astronomers observed and calculated. The mosques stand silent. The manuscript collections rest in their archives and private homes. The Niger River flows nearby, as it has for millennia. The desert wind moves through the streets, carrying sand that slowly, grain by grain, threatens to reclaim what humans have built. But for now, Timbuktu endures. Its story continues. Its legacy persists. The golden city of knowledge is no longer golden, no longer a great center of learning and trade. But it remains a place of memory and meaning, a reminder that human beings can create beauty and wisdom in the most unlikely places, that knowledge can flourish in a desert, that mud and paper and dedication can build something worthy of remembrance. Timbuktu teaches us about the heights we can reach and the depths we can fall to, about the importance of preserving what is precious and the difficulty of doing so. It challenges us to think about what we value, what we choose to protect, what we wish to leave behind. In the end, Timbuktu's greatest legacy may not be any specific manuscript or building, any particular scholarly achievement or historical event, but the simple, powerful fact of its existence. That a city in the heart of the Sahara could become a beacon of civilization proves that geography is not destiny, that human potential is universal, that brilliance and creativity, and the hunger for knowledge are not the property of any single culture or region, but the birthright of humanity itself. This is the gift Timbuktu offers us across the centuries, a gift of pride for Africans whose history has too often been minimized or erased, a gift of humility for those who might think their own cultures have a monopoly on achievement, a gift of hope for all of us, that even in difficult circumstances, even in harsh environments, even when the odds seem impossible, human beings can create something extraordinary. So let the image of Timbuktu in its golden age stay with you as you drift towards sleep. Picture the markets filled with books and spices. Hear the call to prayer echoing from the mosques. See the scholars bent over their manuscripts, copying, studying, preserving. Feel the weight of knowledge that accumulated in that desert city, the vast invisible treasure of ideas and learning that for a few brief centuries made Timbuktu truly one of the wonders of the world. Remember it not as a myth or a legend, not as a vague symbol of remoteness, but as it truly was. A real place where real people did remarkable things, where the human mind flourished in the sand, where the written word was cherished and protected, where for a time against all odds the impossible became real. And so our journey through the history of Timbuktu comes to an end. We have walked its streets in imagination, studied in its schools, traded in its markets, and watched it rise and fall. We have seen how a well in the desert became a crossroads, how a crossroads became a city, how a city became a center of civilization. We have witnessed the golden age and its slow twilight, the conquest and the preservation, the forgetting and the remembering. Through it all, Timbuktu has endured, not as it was but as a presence in history and memory, a place that matters not just for what it contains but for what it represents. Thank you for accompanying me on this voyage into the past. The night is deep now, and it is time to rest. But perhaps, as you sleep, you will dream of distant places and ancient wisdom, of scholars and books, of cities built from dreams and determination in the heart of emptiness. Dream of Timbuktu, the golden city of knowledge, and let its story remind you that the human spirit, armed with nothing more than curiosity and commitment, can illuminate even the darkest and most remote corners of the earth. Sleep well, and may you wake with a renewed sense of what is possible when we choose knowledge over ignorance, preservation over destruction, hope over despair. The desert wind still blows across the Sahara. The stars still wheel overhead, and Timbuktu still stands. A quiet testament to what was and what might yet be. Rest now and dream of golden ages past and perhaps yet to come. Until our next journey into history, good night. The legacy of what Timbuktu achieved during those golden centuries extends into corners of our modern world that we might not immediately recognize. The systems of Islamic education that flourished there, the emphasis on memorization and oral transmission, combined with careful textual study, these methods continue in madrasas across the Islamic world today. The particular style of Maliki jurisprudence that dominated in Timbuktu, with its emphasis on community consensus and practical application, continues to shape legal thinking in West Africa. The manuscript tradition, that painstaking work of copying and preserving texts by hand, taught skills and instilled values about the importance of accuracy and the sacred trust of transmitting knowledge that resonate in modern archival and library science. Even the physical form of Timbuktu's mosques has had a lasting impact. The Sahelian architectural style, with its distinctive minarets and wooden beam scaffolding, has been recognized as a unique African contribution to Islamic architecture. When new mosques are built in the region today, they often deliberately echo this traditional style, maintaining a visual continuity with the past. The Great Mosque of Djenné, in another Malian city not far from Timbuktu, is perhaps the most famous example, the largest mud brick building in the world, and a UNESCO World Heritage Site in its own right. It demonstrates that the building techniques perfected in Timbuktu and other Sahelian cities were not primitive or temporary solutions, but sophisticated technologies perfectly adapted to their environment. The broader impact of Timbuktu on African consciousness and pride cannot be overstated. For generations of Africans and people of African descent around the world, the story of Timbuktu has served as a powerful counter-narrative to racist claims that Africa had no history of civilization or intellectual achievement. When the transatlantic slave trade and colonialism sought to dehumanize Africans and justify their exploitation, the memory of great African kingdoms and cities like Timbuktu, even when that memory was fragmentary or romanticized, provided evidence that Africa's past was not blank or savage but rich and sophisticated. In the 20th century, as African nations gained independence and African scholars began to reclaim their history from colonial distortions, Timbuktu became a symbol of African capability and achievement. This symbolic importance has sometimes created tensions. There can be a tendency to over-romanticize Timbuktu, to make it into a perfect golden age that bears little resemblance to historical reality. The actual medieval city, like all human societies, had its flaws and injustices. It was built partly on the slave trade. Its learning was reserved for a small elite, while most people remained illiterate. Its wealth came from commerce that enriched some while leaving others in poverty. To truly honor Timbuktu's legacy, we must see it whole, celebrating its genuine achievements while acknowledging its limitations and the suffering that occurred within and because of its systems. Yet even with these caveats, the core achievement remains remarkable and worthy of celebration. In an age when much of Europe was struggling with political fragmentation and limited literacy, when access to books was restricted to a tiny clerical elite, Timbuktu had created a culture where books were bought and sold in markets, where private citizens could own hundreds or thousands of volumes, where scholarship was a respected and viable career path. The scale of intellectual activity, the sophistication of the discourse, the connections to global networks of learning, all of this was genuinely impressive by any standard. Timbuktu did not need to be perfect to be important. It simply needed to be real, and it was.